They burned his hands first. Not because he had stolen anything, not because he had committed any crime. They burned his hands because of what those hands had written. 7 words on a piece of parchment that could collapse an empire, dismantle a religion, and rewrite everything humanity believed about itself. The year was 529 AD, and a man whose name was deliberately erased from history stood chained in a stone chamber beneath a monastery that no longer exists. His crime was knowledge, his punishment was silence, but what he had discovered refused to die. This is not a legend. This is not mythology dressed up as history. What you are about to hear has been buried under 15 centuries of fear, politics, and carefully constructed lies. And by the end of this story, you will understand why someone decided the world was never supposed to know. It began in a library. Not the famous one in Alexandria. That was already ashes by then. This was a smaller secret library hidden in the hills of eastern Anatolia, carved into rock, and sealed behind a wall that looked like natural stone. Inside were scrolls written in a language that mixed Greek, Aramaic, and something older. Something no one could fully identify. A monk named Theodorus found the entrance by accident while repairing a crumbling wall after a storm. He was not a scholar. He was not a philosopher. He was a simple man who copied texts and prayed 5 times a day. But when he unrolled the first scroll and held it near candlelight, his hands began to tremble. The scroll described a system, not a religious system, not a political one. It was a system of human consciousness, a detailed, almost scientific explanation of how the human mind creates its own reality, how belief itself is a technology, how empires do not rise because of armies, but because of ideas planted so deeply in people's minds that they mistake them for truth. This was not philosophy. This was a manual. Step by step, it explained how rulers had been engineering belief for thousands of years, how gods were designed, not discovered, how language was shaped to control thought before thought even formed. And it named names. It pointed to specific kingdoms, specific priests, specific moments in history where the engineering had occurred. Theodorus could not sleep for 3 days. He copied portions of the scroll in secret, hiding the copies inside the lining of his robes. He told no one, but his behavior changed. His eyes changed. The other monks noticed, and one of them, a man named Cassius, who had connections to the ecclesiastical authorities in Constantinople, reported him. What happened next is where this story turns dark. Cassius did not report Theodorus out of loyalty to the church. He reported him because Cassius had been placed in that monastery for one specific purpose, to watch for exactly this kind of discovery. He was not a monk. He was a guardian, part of an ancient network whose only job was to ensure certain knowledge never resurfaced. Within a week, soldiers arrived. Not Roman soldiers. These men wore no insignia. They carried no banners. They came at night, in silence, and they knew exactly where to go. They did not search the monastery. They walked directly to the hidden library, as if they had always known it was there. Have you ever wondered why certain periods of history feel hollow? Why centuries pass with almost no recorded advancement in human thought, as if someone pressed pause on civilization's mind? That silence was not natural. It was enforced. The soldiers sealed the library. They removed every scroll, and they took Theodorus to a place that existed outside of any official record, a network of underground chambers used for one purpose, the interrogation of those who had seen too much. But here is where the story fractures into something unexpected. Theodorus had already sent 3 of his copies out of the monastery. He had given them to a traveling merchant named Yusef, a man who moved between Byzantine and Persian territories selling spices and textiles. Yusef could not read Greek. He had no idea what he was carrying. He simply owed Theodorus a debt and agreed to deliver the parcels to 3 different locations. One copy went east, toward Persia. One went south, toward Egypt. And one went north, toward a small community of scholars living on the edges of what is now modern Georgia. 3 seeds, planted in 3 different soils, and each one would grow into something that would quietly reshape the world. The Persian copy landed in the hands of a Zoroastrian scholar who recognized fragments of the language. He spent 11 years decoding it, and what he produced became the foundation of an underground intellectual movement that would eventually influence early Islamic philosophy centuries later. Ideas about the nature of perception, about the architecture of belief. These did not appear from nowhere. They had a source, and the source was that scroll. The Egyptian copy found its way into a Coptic monastery near Nag Hammadi. Yes, the same region where the famous Gnostic texts were later discovered in 1945. Coincidence? Perhaps. But scholars who have studied the timeline quietly admit that the philosophical fingerprints are too similar to ignore. The third copy, the one sent north, disappeared. For almost 800 years, no trace of it existed. And then, in the 14th century, a Georgian manuscript surfaced briefly in a private collection in Venice before vanishing again. The collector who held it reportedly went mad, or at least, that is what the official record claims. People who challenge powerful secrets are often labeled mad. It is the oldest strategy in the book. Now, let us return to Theodorus. What did they do to him in those underground chambers? The historical fragments we have, and they are fragments scattered across Syriac and Armenian texts, suggest he was not simply killed. He was questioned for months. They needed to know if he had understood what the scrolls truly contained. Not just the surface content, but the deeper layer, the mechanism. Because the scrolls did not just describe how belief was engineered. They described how to reverse it, how to dismantle the architecture of control inside a human mind, how to wake someone up from a manufactured reality without destroying them in the process. And that was the real danger. Not the history, not the accusations against empires and religions. The danger was the cure. Think about that for a moment. What would happen today if someone released a genuine step-by-step method for freeing a human mind from every form of psychological control? Every advertisement would lose its power. Every political narrative would collapse. Every institution built on blind obedience would crumble overnight. That is not a metaphor. That is a blueprint for the end of the world as it is structured. And that is exactly why they burned his hands. Not to punish him. To ensure he could never write again. They let him live. They released him back into the world as a broken man who could no longer hold a pen, no longer copy a single word. A living warning to anyone who might stumble upon the same knowledge. But they underestimated something. They underestimated memory. Theodorus could not write, but he could speak. And he did. Quietly, carefully. In the final years of his life, he whispered fragments of what he had read to a small group of followers who memorized his words like prayers. Those followers scattered across the Mediterranean, carrying pieces of the secret in their minds like shrapnel from an explosion that had not yet been heard. If this story is shifting something inside you right now, if you feel that strange pull of recognition, as though some part of you already knew this, then you understand why stories like this matter. You understand why channels like English Mindset exist, not just to teach language, but to open doors in the mind that someone, somewhere, once tried to permanently seal. And if you have made it this far into the story, you are not a casual viewer. You are the kind of person who chases depth, who refuses the surface. A small act, staying with this, sharing it, subscribing, is how stories like this survive in an algorithm designed to bury them under noise. The fragments Theodorus whispered did not stay buried. Over the following centuries, they surfaced in strange places. In the mystical poetry of Rumi, who spoke of the mind as a guest house. In the philosophical writings of Ibn Arabi, who described reality as a mirror reflecting the viewer's own assumptions. In the radical ideas of Meister Eckhart, a Christian mystic who was nearly declared a heretic for suggesting that God and the human mind were not separate. None of these thinkers cited Theodorus by name. His name had been erased too thoroughly, but the ideas, the specific structure of the ideas, the way they frame consciousness as the primary technology of civilization, Those are not things that arise independently in cultures separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years. They travel, they survive, they wait. What does this mean for you, sitting here right now, in a world more saturated with engineered belief than any empire Theodorus could have envisioned? What scroll is hidden inside your own mind, waiting behind a wall you have mistaken for something permanent? The forbidden secret was never really about history. It was about the present. It was about the fact that the mind you are using right now, the one processing these words, forming opinions, deciding what is real, was shaped by forces you never chose and never examined. The scrolls described a world where people live inside stories written by someone else and never think to ask who the author is. 1,500 years ago, a man lost his hands for trying to share this. Libraries were sealed. Guardians were deployed. Entire intellectual traditions were either absorbed, diluted, or destroyed to prevent one idea from reaching the general population: that you are not your beliefs. That the voice inside your head narrating your life may not be yours. That freedom is not a political condition. It is a cognitive one. And yet here you are, hearing it anyway. Across 15 centuries, through fire and silence and erasure, the idea found you, not because of magic, because of the stubbornness of truth, because some things, once thought, cannot be unthought, because Theodorus whispered, and someone remembered, and someone wrote it down in a poem, and someone translated that poem, and someone read it aloud in a room where someone else was listening. The chain never broke. It bent. It hid. It disguised itself as poetry, as philosophy, as mysticism, as madness. But it never broke. So here is the question that matters, and I'm not asking it lightly. If Theodorus were alive today, if he could see the world as it is now, would he believe his sacrifice was worth it? Would he look at humanity and see minds that are waking up, or minds that are more deeply asleep than ever before? Tell me what you think, not what sounds right. What you actually believe when you are honest with yourself. This is the space English mindset was built for. Not for easy answers. Not for comfortable repetition. For the kind of thinking that leaves a mark. The scrolls may be gone. The library may be sealed. But the secret is out. It has been out for 1,500 years, hiding in plain sight, waiting for minds willing to see it. The only question left is whether you will do what Theodorus did. Not burn for the truth, just refuse to look away from it, away from